So welcome to this SoloHaus Homes talk about SoloHaus. It's a tiny modular home for people who've been experiencing homelessness. And SoloHaus has the lowest energy consumption of any home that we've featured in Open Eco Homes since we started in 2010. And it's not just because it's small, but also because it's got lots of eco features designed by the house builder Hill. And our first speaker is Rory Lowings, who's the SoloHaus Project Manager of the Hill Group. And he's going to talk about their project and eco features and the clever design to suit the residents. So thank you. Over to you, Rory.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name's Rory. I'm the SoloHaus Project Manager for Hill. And I'm here really to talk to you about a project which we've been working on now for 3 years, getting on for 3 years. Yeah, it's 3 years now the project's been running, and it's our SoloHaus Foundation 200 project. What you can see in this image here is one of our largest schemes that we've produced so far using a purpose-built modular home. That is the SoloHaus unit you can see here. There's 16 of them in this image, and this was taken in Haringey in Tottenham, right next to South Tottenham Overground Station. What you are looking at here is 16 steel-framed, steel-walled homes that were built in a factory in Shrewsbury and transported to site on the back of a truck. We designed the SoloHaus 4 years ago now, getting on, back end of 2019, as part of the 20th anniversary of the Hill firm and Andy Hill's project, which he wanted to commit to delivering 200 homes free of charge to a variety of charities around the UK, working with people who are moving out of homelessness and hopefully into something more stable and permanent, and to give them a facility that they could use to stabilize their situations, get themselves their own front door, and a self-contained, well-designed, energy-efficient home. All of those elements, the self-contained element and the well-designed element and the energy-efficient element, are all key to why the SoloHaus looks the way it does and does what it does. Mark Allan from Jimmy's, who has 16 of these in his portfolio, which we donated to Jimmy's in 2020 and 2021 through Foundation 200, we'll be able to talk a bit more about the experience of using them, but I'm just going to tell you a bit about the technological aspect of it. So the SoloHaus, from the outside, you can see in this image here, is obviously a shipping container looking thing, but despite its resemblance to a shipping container, it is not one. It only follows the same design principles in as much as you can put it on the back of a truck, lug it around by a crane, send it across the country from one end to the other over the course of the 60-year design life that it was built with. And it will not suffer any harm. You'll be able to transport it over and over again with relative ease. And in that respect, it differs from a good deal of off-site construction that's done, where there's a fair bit of assembly to be done on site with a normal multi-part home. This module is transported as a single piece, as you see it, and stacked like Lego. But moving on, the SoloHaus, I think I mentioned earlier, is designed to be self-contained. The idea really was, when we started this project, we ended up speaking to charities like St. Martin in the Fields in London, who really told us that one of the things that was lacking in their existing accommodation provision, and a fair few charities lack to some extent, is a kind of transitional form of accommodation between the traditional night shelter hostel type setup and permanent accommodation through the council, through some sort of general needs housing provision. The idea really was that we would provide some sort of stepping stone, a home that somebody could call a home, could be private in, and have a sort of private life, but was always intended for them to eventually move out of once the situation for them had stabilized a bit and they were more comfortable in private accommodation. Of course, an awful lot of people who've been homeless for a while have not had their own space for a long time, or perhaps never had their own space, and it was really to give them ease them into a new private living situation. Everything that you can see in this image here, with the exception of the TV and the dozen or so copies of Hill's annual report, is what comes with each home. And the idea really is that somebody can move in with no furniture, no stuff, and can settle in quite quickly without having to worry about making an awful lot of investment in it. And so, yes, when we gift a scheme to a charity like Jimmy's or like Emmaus, we will complete not just the homes, but the landscaping. Obviously, we'll install them and we'll finish the site to a good standard as we would any of our other traditional housing projects, either in Cambridge or elsewhere. So the furniture suite obviously includes furniture, it includes kitchen equipment, it includes washing machine, and it includes a number of other features, which I will share with you as we go on, in terms of reducing the energy consumption of the home. We have, just in brief, a kind of a BOPAS accredited manufacturing process, which ensures the design life. So the structural element is designed to last for 60 years. We have obviously a very high performance doors and windows that are designed to be secure. And well, they are secured by design. They are also extremely energy efficient, and we'll get onto that in a little bit. But as you can see here, we have a bathroom with shower, and the intention again is to give people that privacy that they might not necessarily have in a shared house, but they would have here, and the ability to control their space as well. So we have a separate back bedroom here with its own escape window that again people can kind of control the living environment to a great extent. Then they have various places that they can kind of cocoon themselves and give themselves privacy. Insulation wise, we'll talk about thermal performance in a little bit, but acoustic insulation was part of that whole story. Each of the homes that you can see from the outside is a fully self-contained. There isn't an adjoining wall. We have about 150 mil air gap between each module, and each module is individually wind and watertight and has acoustic insulation that will exceed existing building regs and will create a very quiet environment for people living in there. That's one of the things that people always say when they first step inside, is actually how quiet it is relative to almost anything else available. Everything that you can see in this image here is exactly what you've seen in the previous photographs, but on a floor plan. So the front door is at the bottom of this image, and the back window that you just saw in the photo of the bedroom previously is at the top. And you effectively have a dual aspect home. So you have a front window and a back window, and those long walls are designed to basically stand side by side with a terrace of other modules along those lines. We wanted it to be able to create quite space efficient schemes. And the reason for that, we knew we'd be working with charities, and we knew we'd be working with councils who would have sites that are perhaps brownfield sites, perhaps backland sites, but basically would be sites that would otherwise be undevelopable for traditional housing, and that we wanted to kind of create the toolkit to bring them into beneficial use where the location was appropriate. And yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about what sort of locations are appropriate and how best to integrate a scheme into the urban landscape. I wouldn't necessarily say we've got it right every time, and Mark and I have discussed that a bit as well. But the bottom line is we will try and get locations from councils or from other landowners which are close enough to local amenities that people can easily get to them on foot, and while also not being too exposed to kind of everything in the public domain, that they do feel relatively secluded and possible to form a kind of cul-de-sac or a close effect. So now, what you came here for was sustainability, though, I believe. So there are three components which make the SoloHaus homes energy efficient. One of them is the fabric insulation of the building, which is designed to meet future home standards. The air tightness is extremely high on these units. The U values are extremely good. And the idea really is that even without input of energy, you have a physical structure that can retain a huge amount of its heat for a long time. It shouldn't be drafty, it shouldn't be leaking. And that's kind of the same principle you'd apply to a passive house. We try to apply to this. This wouldn't necessarily pass passive house, but they're the same design idea, really. That combines with a mechanical ventilation heat recovery system, an MVHR, which is intended to recycle any heat that would normally be lost by a traditional extractor fan back into an inflowing air supply. So mechanical ventilation obviously provides fresh air, but you don't you shouldn't be losing any of the heat from an extractor. The MVHR will take care of that and will ensure that that's brought back into the system. And finally, the third thing that feeds into energy efficiency is the heat source itself that provides hot water and heating, which is a single Valent air source heat pump. Valent's a French manufacturer. They produce an 11 kilowatt air source heat pump that we have supplied with every scheme, but we have designed the plant room with the shared water supply to serve 6 SoloHaus homes. So the idea is you have a single air source heat pump for 6 homes. You are splitting the cost of that over 6 units is much more efficient than trying to heat them individually, and certainly more than a traditional heating system. Now we come to the claim at the bottom of this slide, which is that the homes are designed to have a £5 a week running costs. Now, this is a design number, and it still comes out in our SAP 10 assessments. And Mark has provided me with some more granular information, and that is not what they're paying on their bills. It seems that they're paying more than that. But I think the £5 a week running costs is based on, I think it's pre-2021, pre-price hike to 2021 rates. And the point really being that this is still significantly more efficient than effectively a building control compliant home would be. It exceeds the heat retention that we would still expect. So I think we've got some work to do on what we actually claim for this. But on the SAP 10 report, when we feed in the data we have for the insulation quality, we will still be coming out as a predicted £4.80, I think, per week energy cost, which is good. I think they'll have to look at those rates again. But those 3 elements combined, the point being, make them very energy efficient. And the reason we wanted to do that is because when we gifted to organizations like Jimmy's, we wanted them to have an asset that would be useful long term. It wouldn't sort of just be compliant this year and then move out of compliance the next. That there would be a degree of efficiency built in that wouldn't change over time, and that would ensure that people have a warm, good, decent quality home to live in. Just to sort of say, make the point, Foundation 200, when we deliver schemes like this through Foundation 200, we deliver them free of charge. So Andy Hill pays for them out of a £15 million budget that was allocated for it. And we will work, generally speaking, with local authorities or other local landowners who will also contribute land free of charge. I was working for Cambridge City Council when we organised the Cambridge schemes, and I believe there is nominal rent for those, but I think we had quite a generous valuation. Perhaps Mark will be able to tell me more than that one. But the idea really is that people are put in the resources they have available, whether that's land, whether that's in our case building skills, and the modules themselves, and the 20-year record of delivering schemes in quite small constrained places. In this case, I believe this was some original art that was donated to the first scheme delivered in Cambridge by a local artist who's in the photo here. And he was kind enough to produce a number of really nice sort of rural landscapes and for the residents to enjoy when they first moved in. And that's the sort of thing that we try and get people involved with on the delivery, and it makes the difference. Little Speed Walk in Cambridge was our first scheme. It's the smallest scheme we've ever done. It's 4 homes, and it is still it's the longest tenanted one. Mark will be able to say a bit more about it as well. He's been running it for the last close to 3 years. We handed that over in December 2020. Scaling up, we've done a number of other sites that are contractual jobs for local authorities, in this case Ipswich. We've also done comparable schemes in Stevenage and in Hemel Hempstead. We've recently started installing homes in partnership with Cornwall Council as well, which I'll show you in a moment. But the point is that we've now done a few of these in a few different settings, on 1 story and on 2 stories. The largest scheme, which you might recall from the first image of this is what it really looks like before we change the colours to blue. But this is now at South Tottenham and has been lived in since, I want to say, the back end of 2021. I can't remember the exact day people started moving in, but it was certainly the back end of October 2021. So that's, again, had a bit of a track record now and is used directly by Haringey Council as part of their housing provision. And Cornwall, finally, we've started to assist Cornwall Council in installing a whole slew of modules down there, because they also have a significant homelessness problem, getting worse every year. One of the worst, I think, is the worst local authority for homelessness outside the city of Westminster. So yeah, we were quite pleased to be assisting them with that. But that's kind of the whistle-stop tour through the SoloHaus. Happy to take any questions or hand back to Tom.
Well, thanks very much, Rory. I can't see any questions yet, so now's your chance to be dropping your questions for Rory, particularly about the homes. Maybe save questions about the support of the residents for Mark to answer later. But maybe in the meantime, I was curious, Rory, about the ability to move the homes. And so have any already been moved in their position, and do you have to end up replacing some bits?
So I'll answer. There was one question came through as well, Tom, which I'll answer first because it's a quick one. To Anne, correct. The MVHR is individual, so each individual unit has a separate MVHR. That's not shared. So Tom, there's a couple more questions have also come in, and I'll get to those. But Tom, to answer your question, so the movable aspect, I'll actually go back to the photo I had a moment ago, because it's quite useful to see. The homes are designed to be lifted from effectively roof level. You can just about make out there lifting eyes that are screwed into the top of each module. Those are removable.
No, you're not sharing it at the moment.
Am I not? Oh, I haven't clicked the share yet. Okay, that's very good, isn't it?
Thanks.
2 years of pandemic, I can't remember how to use the share function. So you can see the lifting eyes at the top of this module here. Those are designed to clip onto this special lifting rig. But effectively, if you have that lifting rig and the eyes are properly screwed into the module, you can lift it from the roof using the cage structure effectively. So that's the structural element, which carries everything else inside it. All that is required to transport a home is to unbolt it from its footings. You can't see here, but we would normally bolt down onto a concrete pad type foundation. You can unclip any closing panels between individual modules, which we do just to create a neat flush front to a given scheme. And then you quite literally clip it back onto the lifting rig and hoist it onto the back of a flatbed truck. We have done this on numerous occasions, both transporting the modules from location to location, and also now we're starting to transport modules that we had settled and put on footings and then sort of landscaped up to create a level access. We're starting to move those now for the first time, and we're finding that they transport absolutely fine. The only thing that we do find is that there's a bit of internal cracking on the surface finishes, which we have to make good with a little bit of wet work on the other end. But for the vast majority of units, it's superficial, and we land them again, and they're more or less ready to go within a couple of days. So I hope that answers your question, Tom.
Thanks. Would you like
to in chat now?
Yep.
And so if I take them in order, and we'll ask the person who's asking the question in chat to unmute, and gives you the opportunity to expand upon your question if you wish. So the first question that came in was from Anne Miller. If you'd like to repeat your question.
Well, I think in a way it's been answered, but I imagine it's quite a small MVHR.
Yes, it's a. I mean, well, I say that they're quite large boxes. I'm just trying to think. They'd probably be sort of 800 mil wide by maybe a couple of hundred, maybe 250 mil deep, I would think. But I would say they're the sort of domestic MVHR that you would see inside a home, covering a small new build house. So they're not specialist equipment. They're quite common, standard type of MVHR.
Okay, next up in the questions list, hopefully that was answered sufficiently, Anne. Next up on the questions list is Ian Cray, if you'd like to unmute.
Hi, Rory.
Hello, Ian.
I was just, obviously, the arrangement with the Shrewsbury facilities, commercial, and obviously there's some confidentiality, but is it one format, or by did the different colours of the units, like the Cornwall one, is significantly different? Is it one standard format throughout?
So the SoloHaus is, generally speaking, one standard format. We have done one or two variations with the kitchen specification for individual clients. So Hemel Hempstead ended up buying them. They wanted ovens in them as well as the microwave and the hob setup that we had. So we did install those for them, but they paid for those modifications to happen. We've done a couple of additional types of modules. So there's a longer version of the SoloHaus that's got a double bed in it, which we designed last year, a couple of years ago actually now. We've not deployed them en masse yet, although I'm having a consignment of those go out next week. There's also a double hull version, which is intended to be for sort of family group accommodation. But again, that's only prototype at this stage. So we've done a couple of other variations, but mostly it's this.
I guess I was asking in the context of the cost curve, and how far down the cost curve do you think you've got in terms of providing, clearly there's supply chain costs and impact costs.
Yeah.
In terms of the costs that the Shrewsbury operators in control of,
Good question, Ian. So to your initial question, what the arrangement is, we have a 50% stake in the factory in Shrewsbury. So Andy Hill owns half of it, and their director owns half of it. So to some extent, they're a sister business. They now produce a few different things for us. So they produce modular homes. They also produce modular bathrooms and utility cupboards that we use in our flatted developments. And I would say we probably aren't as far down the cost curve as we'd like to be. And I would defy that many modular producers in the UK to say they are. It's difficult to get something so standardized that it never requires any modifications for individual clients. We effectively, through Foundation 200, created a situation where we could get decent values out of manufacturing a standard product and effectively delivering it as a standard offer to a variety of charities around the country. So we don't have a huge amount of variation within our SoloHaus modules. So I would say we're how far down are we? How long is a piece of string? We're getting there, I would say. And we every time we do a production run, we manage to find more efficiencies with it. But it's always being a novel product. There are always things we have to pick up that we didn't expect to, whether it's questions from building control that we need to answer, and then we need to do a little bit more modeling for an individual sort of building assessment in a specific site, particularly Cornwall. We found more extreme weather conditions they were modeling for. We had to redo all our tests basically for building control. So it's that sort of thing where we've tried to make it as adaptable as possible, and we've generally been able to adapt it fine. But again, I mean, I think if we were going to do another production run of these next year, we would do them a bit differently again to how we've done them this year for a few reasons. But yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, we've got a few more questions from Nicola, Jack, and one from myself as well. Nicola, it seems like we're going to have a little conversation between you and Rory here with some great questions. Far away.
My first question is, do these homes meet normal housing standards? I have a feeling that they're too small, but I don't know what regulations have to be bent, I don't know, to make this work.
I think it's a good way of describing it that our homes are compliant with building regs in every respect but one, Nicola, which is the floor space. So nationally described space standards require a minimum of 37 square meters for a single occupancy home. These are 24. And the reason we designed them this way is a few different reasons. One is we, again, weren't intending these to be permanently occupied homes. And everywhere that we've installed them, there has been a limit placed on how long a single individual can stay in them. Because the intention is that they're part of an ongoing process that a charity who's working with the individuals concerned will be sort of on a journey with them, away from quite an unstable living situation to, with any luck, a more stable living situation. This is, as I said, the stepping stone quality. Our various partners that we've done with, we've done building control assessments all over the country now, and they've always been acceptable to building control from a safety perspective. They're fire rated to 60 minutes on all sides, and obviously they meet the energy performance criteria that are required as well. But yeah, that floor space element is the one place that we haven't met. You mentioned obviously level access and wheelchair. You can get a wheelchair in and in theory steer it around. We designed the corridor width and the door width to be about right, but I was pulled up by a consultant earlier in the year in Cornwall. He's pointed out we don't actually have the turning circle in the bedroom to make it a wheelchair user sort of completely wheelchair user compatible home. It wouldn't meet the space standards anyway, but we wanted it to be as flexible as possible for people who might have a range of mobility aids, but it's not a wheelchair adapted home. We would need to make some more modifications before it was, but we wanted it to be friendly for people who've got not necessarily wheelchair users, but might have a few different issues, and so we've wanted to make it wide enough to accommodate a few different things, and it is.
You don't have to answer the one about the solar panels. That's a silly question.
It's a fair one though, and the idea is we did design a sort of roof rack to go on the flat roof with solar PVs. What we haven't done yet is we haven't done a scheme with solar PVs yet, and we also haven't satisfied ourselves that we would be able to get decent enough battery storage to try a proper off-grid scheme. Which is, I think, where we're currently falling down on it. But in terms of we could put solar PVs and don't feed into the grid, it'd probably quite good value to do that. We just haven't done it yet. So,
and the very last question was there anything in the plant room other than the air source heat pump? It seemed like quite a big room. But...
So those modules that Jimmy's has are the first edition of the plant room, and they are bigger than they need to be. In fact, the air source heat pump doesn't sit inside the plant room at all. It sits outside and next to it. What's in the plant room is the 300-litre hot water cylinder, which serves all of the individual modules and the various pumps that control how that interacts with the thermostats in the modules. But we had to redesign that because it is a mighty thing that we ended up producing. We mostly did it actually out of spare parts for the rest of the modules, so it's incredibly strong for what it is. We value engineered that quite quickly.
As I think I said, Mark is Chief Exec of the homeless charity Jimmy's, and looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, Mark.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm Mark. I'm the Chief Executive at Jimmy's. I've been there about 4 years. Jimmy's, for anyone that doesn't know, is a homeless charity based in Cambridge, and we work with people who are rough sleeping or who have just been rough sleeping or just about to rough sleep and try to stop them actually rough sleeping. One night of rough sleeping is incredibly scary, and the longer the person is on the street, the worse it is for that person. So the aim is to get people off the streets as quickly as possible. We have of those pictures there, the top left is our original hostel based on East Road. Started in the crypt of a church, even though it's not a religious organisation, but it started in the crypt of a church and now is a 25-bed with ensuite rooms hostel where people typically stay with us for a couple of months before moving on to something else while we work out what it is that they best need. The photo on the top right there is just some volunteers. We rely on volunteers from across Cambridge to help Jimmy's, and whether that's helping with meals and providing support, gardening, etc. The bottom right there is a hostel that we've just recently opened for 9 people with complex needs. Often the people that you see on the streets that are really struggling and may appear quite chaotic. And it's very challenging to find the right sort of place for them. So we have a new hostel with only 9 beds to support those most complex individuals and try and keep them in somewhere as best we can. On the left there is a picture of some modular homes in the background with a dog, and I quite like putting the dog picture because we're very pet friendly and we have dogs. We have residents, people who come in with cats, we've had hamsters. So, animals are very important to all of us, and in particular important to the people that we help. And I think that's important because you try getting a flat to rent that will take dogs and it can be incredibly difficult. Okay, next. So we, at the start of this project, we wanted to work with Cambridge University to make sure that, because it's a brand new project, and how do you know if it's even working? It's a great idea. Everyone's talking about modular homes, but does it actually work? So we wanted to make sure that we collected evidence along the way to tell us what was working and what wasn't working. And so I just want to take you through the sort of 5 key lessons. And there's a link at the end to the actual report if you want to read it in full. And it's quite a useful guide if you want to try and, if you're in the sort of position of having to persuade the powers that be of the pros and cons of modular homes, then it's a useful evidence-based document to do that. So the first one is that we think it is a great way to provide housing more quickly and cheaply if we have unused land. So one of the problems that we have is that people get stuck. They get stuck because there's no housing available for them. There's no housing with the council because they're full. You can't go into a private tenancy because it's incredibly expensive and the housing benefit won't cover it. So it's a great way. So we've been able, in the last 3 years with our partners, been able to bring into Cambridge, in effect, 22 homes for people who would otherwise be rough sleeping. And that's all happened quite quickly and during the pandemic. The top ones are with our partners Alia and New Meaning Foundation. So they were the first site to go in, and then the bottom right ones are the hill ones, which were orange, but we have painted them blue because the residents and the neighbours didn't like the orange, but I think they are all now blue anyway. And the top site is on a church bit of land. So churches across the country have land, and so that's it's a great example of a church saying, we've got a bit of land, why not use that to put some modular homes on them? And then the bottom right ones are on council land, and again, councils have got land, in this case on the edge of 3 different council estates, where you can't build housing, but you can get permission for interim housing such as modular homes. Next. Lesson learned 2 is site design is important. And the feedback from the residents that Cambridge University spoke to the residents was that low numbers of people living together is really important, because what you don't want to do is create some sort of ghetto of people that have been rough sleeping. And it's not a criticism of people that have been rough sleeping. It's just that in order to move on with your life, you don't need to be surrounded with lots of people that have, are also trying to sort out their lives. You want to be mixed in with the broader community and connect with people and organizations and services in the broader community. So low numbers of units based on resident feedback is important. And the second one is about communal spaces. So you're trying to create a little mini community where a group of people can support each other to help them with their lives. And we've got 4 sites, and only a couple of them have got a decent communal space, and that works better than the ones that don't. So we think it's really important not just to pack land with housing, but to create communal shared spaces as well. The third lesson, which was a hard lesson for us to learn, is that pre-tenancy work is essential before moving someone in to ensure it's going to work for that person. So initially we thought, great, this will help with lots of the people that we want to help, and it's particularly important for some people who need their own space. So rather than being in a shared house or a hostel, they need their own space in order to be on that recovery journey. But if someone's not ready for it, and it doesn't work, then it's quite a step back for that person. And actually moving into a 1-bedroom property on your own can be very isolating, and particularly if you've been part of some community before that, even if that was in prison or the armed services or in care, to suddenly be on your own can be terrifying, and that doesn't work for some people. There's also issues with who might knock at your door and what temptations might be offered. So you've got to be pretty resilient to be able to cope with whoever might knock at your door and say no. So we do sort of 4 to 8 weeks, about 4 to 8 weeks of work with people before they move in to make sure they are in fact ready to move in. And we found that works much, much better. And that's Barry, one of our workers, and that's Eamon on the left, one of our residents, who has just moved out of the modular home and moved into a permanent council tenancy. Fourth one, which I couldn't find a picture for, it's a little boring one, but if you can offer licenses, or I think the council have an equivalent for temporary accommodation, this works best during your learning phase. So when you're starting out and you're trying to work out how this works, if you end up having someone in one of the modular homes that's causing a problem, it has a massive effect on the other residents and on neighbours. With a license, you can move someone out quite quickly, whereas in a shared short-hold tenancy, it can take about 3 or 4 months before you can move someone out. We obviously want to offer people the best possible tenancy, but during the learning phase, until you know you've got it right, if you're setting up a new service, you need to be able to move people out where it isn't working, particularly when there's antisocial behaviour involved, just because it has such a massive impact. And then the fifth one I wanted to mention was, and that's Eamon again on the right, is that there have been successes. So Eamon is the perfect example, really. So he moved into the first site, the sort of Alia New Meaning Foundation site, about 3 years ago now. And then we have a team of support workers who make contact with the residents on a daily basis to help them with whatever it is that they need, whether that's reconnecting with family or maintaining drug and alcohol recovery plans, starting to think about work, and about moving into a longer term home. And a number of residents fed back to the university that they were, on that journey, and it's been a really positive experience. And I give that picture as a great example, because actually Prince William contacted Jimmy's and said, we'd like to come and visit your modular homes. And they went and they visited Eamon, who took them into his home and talked about his experience of modular homes and how great they were for him. So there are some great successes with modular homes. And based on all the lessons that we've learned from the research, then we recommend them as a solution to homelessness in this country. So that's it from me. And I think the last slide there was just a link, which I think we'll send out if you want to find out a bit more and to get the full report from Cambridge University. That's it from me. I think I've got one question.
Oh, yes.
I know that wasn't an equal presentation, but at least that was about what it's actually about in the end, which is for the people, isn't it? So.
Oh yes, and the questions are rolling in now. Would you like to start the ball rolling and unmute?
You mean me? Was I the first?
Yes.
Right. So how are you managing to find places for people to move on to? How long do you think people could stay in there? Are they really too small? I mean, it seems very small, but.
So in terms of the moving on part, so because we've got the support of Cambridge University, when someone is ready to move on, then we can get them the top band on the housing register, which means that person can bid for a permanent home, and it normally takes about 6 months to 1 year to get that permanent home. So that's an agreement we've made with Cambridge Council, because it keeps people moving, and then we can offer the modular homes to someone else. So that works really well. And then the second part, what was the second part to that?
Well, this whole 24 metres square, 37 metres square.
Oh yeah, so that's just it's, I don't know, it's sort of a myth about what we think we need for space to live in. They love it. The feedback universally from residents, and they love it. And if you think about the choices to live in a room in a shared house with a load of other people, or to live in a hostel, actually you've got your own living room and kitchen, your own bathroom, your own shower, your own washing machine, your own bedroom, some cases your own veranda, and then a communal garden, and not one person has complained about the space. So from a resident feedback perspective, the space size is great. Obviously, when they want to move on and have relationships and that type of thing, then obviously it won't work, but it definitely works for a single person for a couple of years.
Okay, the next question on the list was from Jack Scriven. Jack, if you'd like to unmute. And you also had a question from the previous talk for Rory, who appears to be muted and video off at the moment. He might be grabbing himself a spot of dinner.
I'm here.
Still around. So, Jack, if you'd like to ask a question for Mark first, we might be able to get a question in for Rory as well.
Can I sneak in a second question? So I guess the first question is, what's the biggest barrier for you, Mark, at Jimmy's in terms of rolling them out and providing more modular homes in Cambridge? And the sneaky second question I wanted to add in was, how does the SoloHaus compare to the New Meaning Foundation Alia modular homes in terms of the benefits for residents and for you as someone who's operating them?
Okay. The biggest barrier is, whether it's us or another organization rolling them out, because we don't want to become some massive organization that's got, like a housing association. But in terms of other organizations, it's land, particularly somewhere like Cambridge, where, if you own a bit of land, then you probably want to do something on it that's going to make you a bit of money. You probably don't want to use it for some interim modular homes that you have to sort of rent out a peppercorn rent to a charity like Jimmy's. So I think that's the main challenge. Obviously, money as well. It does cost. But land seems to be, and I know there's another organisation called It Takes a City, and they're about to launch 3 or 4 new homes, and they've spent years trying to find land. And they've only found one bit of land so far that can actually work. So that's the biggest barrier, I think. And in terms of the differences between the two, the feedback from residents is the same. And actually working with New Meaning Foundation and Alia and working with Hill, they're both incredibly supportive, and any issues or problems are dealt with. They're both a very similar size. I think there might be 1 meter square in them. Some people like the New Meaning Foundation ones because they're sort of wooden. They've got that sort of chalet look. Some people like the Hill ones. I think it's just, yeah. There's Alia in the audience and Hill in the audience. So, and they've both been amazing to Jimmy's.
Too close to call. No.
Too close to call. You're very welcome to. I'm very happy to show you around them both, and then you can make your own mind up.
On a practical note, do they have similar energy efficiency and as well as the sort of space in terms of the practical kind of operating? As they work in a similar way, do they? There's no real.
Yeah, and for us, there isn't really any cost difference between them. Although the Hill ones are cheaper because they've donated them to us. We don't have to rent them, whereas the ones from Alia, they rent them to us, so they do cost more. Which the downside is that then the rent is higher. So having them donated to an organisation like Jimmy's from Hill is incredible and does make a big difference in terms of that ongoing cost.
Really? Okay, thanks very much. That's really helpful, Mark.
Jack, did you have a question for Rory you wanted to ask as well?
Oh, I did. Yeah, sorry. Hogging all the questions, but I had one question, which was what do you expect to happen to the units at the end of 60 years? Can they be refurbished, or do you have a sort of view on that?
So, the 60-year design life is basically the maximum that you can get somebody to sign off as a building's design life. You wouldn't get anyone to sign off a bricks and mortar house for more than 60 years in terms of guarantee. So what we've effectively had with BOPAS is a certification that this is built to be as strong as it can be. You will get the full duration of a traditional house out of it. In terms of what will happen after 60 years, they won't fall apart. What will happen to them will probably depend on how they've been looked after. But provided that they've not, if they've taken any hits, they've had sort of, external sort of cladding looked at and repaired and sealed and so on, you will still have a very robust steel hull. Structurally, there's nothing inside the module that you can't remove. So you could certainly refurbish them. I mean, in principle, you could keep on using them for exactly what they're designed to be, provided you're happy sort of just fixing them up over time. It's difficult to know, though, to be honest, Jack, because we have a great example in Abbey, where there are both the New Meaning and the SoloHaus units. We also have the Catholic Church of St. Vincent de Paul, which is an Edwardian prefab made out of corrugated steel that has been a school and a hospital and been back and forth between Britain and France a couple of times since about, I think, something like 1911 when it was designed. And I mean, that has had a design life well in excess of what it would ever have been predicted to have, with very, very different standard of metallurgy to what we designed the SoloHaus with. So the other side of it, of course, is what we could do with the steel. If you wanted to recycle the entire thing, we did think about how you would use the steel components and could they be recycled. And the answer is yes, they could. But steel recycling is a dicey argument, I believe, in sustainability circles, and it would probably be a case of trying to repurpose the components rather than melting them down. But yeah, the 60-year is not a hard cutoff, and I would anticipate that they'll still be being used for housing as long as they're still standing.
Brilliant, thank you. I thought that might be the case with the number, so that's useful to know.
Okay, next up on the questions is Anne Miller, if you'd like to unmute. I believe you've also got an outstanding question for Rory as well, but if we could go with your question for Mark first.
Yeah. Hi, Mark. I was just wondering about whether people manage to keep their big dogs in there as well. I mean, hamsters, clearly no problem.
Well, there was one guy who had a dog. He's the dog in the picture. The dog's called Dave. So he's quite a big dog, and he lived very successfully in that modular home. And then one of the hill sites, there's a man, he has his dog. I think it's like an Alsatian, so also a big dog. And they're living successfully together. It works better than the shared houses, actually, because there's often tension in the shared houses if someone has a dog and you've got one person that's not so keen on the dog. So actually, I would say it works better in the modular homes.
And my question, thank you. And my question for Rory was, I think I've heard that several modular home manufacturers have gone bust recently, or out of business, and that seems a real shame, because it would just seem a logical way of constructing homes. I mean, not just 25 square meter ones, with the current British climate and everything.
So that's a very good question, Anne, and I think we have had a couple of high-profile casualties this year. So many years ago, I worked at Homes England, and the coming firm, the firm that was really going to turn things around for the modular sector in the UK, was Legal & General, and they'd invested in this whacking great factory up in Yorkshire, which unfortunately, as of this year, has now been shuttered. So I'm not entirely sure on what led to the LNG closing down, but I know they had a pretty bad case in London. One of their schemes had significant technical faults. We've had others where that's not the case. I mean, Ilka, obviously, Homes was the other one up north, which didn't do so well. They were going quite great guns at the start of the year, and I don't think it was any one factor which led to them going under. But what tends to happen, I would say, Anne, is that what we see is an enthusiasm cycle for modern methods of construction. We have one or two projects that really expand the sector and invest in firms, and you suddenly see an awful lot being produced for a short period of time. But that's not necessarily always followed up with then subsequent orders. And what I find, so what you then see is obviously if a firm hits a wall, they run out of work, and effectively they have to either rapidly downsize or completely fold. because you can't just keep building things one scheme at a time the way you can in traditional building. You have to keep churning out production, like the automotive industry does, and that's something that doesn't quite work for a lot of the way we think about housing delivery. So one of the things I sort of learned quite early on in this is our housing delivery process, every aspect of our housing delivery process assumes a slow and traditional build, but also quite a slow and traditional planning and design development. So if you want to use a bit of land, you generally go to an architect, and the architect draws up a scheme that's custom designed for that land. And then that gets taken through planning. And then by the time you've got planning permission, you've got something that everybody agrees on, but so far is completely imaginary, and you go to a developer to then cost out what it would cost to develop it. And obviously there's more complicated than that, but very few people start with the idea that we're going to take a piece of land and we are going to use somebody's standard loadout product to make it into a housing scheme, thereby bypassing the sort of traditional creative bit that is one of the things people like best about housing development. And that has been a bit of a challenge, I think, for us, is that we have a standard product. We designed it to be flexible, but it's not that flexible. It will always look more or less the same. And that sometimes it can be a bit intimidating for people to then take on a project, whether it's with us or with any other MMC manufacturer, to sort of say, oh, well, we're going to have exactly the same as these people had, because everybody kind of wants their own grand designs thing. So I think that's a cultural thing as much as anything else. There's various economic impacts on it as well. I think modular, as Ian referred to earlier, unless you're at the right point in that cost curve, you are not necessarily always able to compete with traditional build. And traditional build has a very robust supply chain, and large firms who can get big economies of scale in a way that most players in the modular sector do not. It goes to that cultural thing. I think people's cultural expectations are often for things quite different than what you can build in factories. And you don't just change that sort of thing overnight. That takes years to change. So I don't know if that, I hope that answers the question, but those would be the things that I would note from doing this for the last 3 years.
I was just wondering whether it's different in other parts of the world. And also the implication is that at the moment it's not actually cheaper than traditional building, but I was just kind of assuming that this was going to be way cheaper.
Well, only if you can get the numbers of production up. So, I mean, a good example being our SoloHaus. We've turned out several hundred of them, and they have been relatively efficient, but they've also all been more or less identical, with the exception of 1 or 2 tweaks. And that's just not necessarily what the market always demands. The market often wants something that's quite customizable and that you can kind of, if you wanted to add an extension to one of our modular homes, you'd have to think very differently about it than you would adding an extension to a bricks and mortar home. Completely differently, different technology, different set of skills. And so for that reason, modular firms tend to fall into 2 categories. You have those like us who are producing some form of standard product. Often it can look quite different on site, but under the skin, it's often very, very similar structurally from the same manufacturer anyway. Or you have the ones who specialize in quite boutique developments. So you have, manufacturers, particularly you find those sorts up in Scotland, people who use very custom timber frames and design every building very specially. And they don't make very much, but what they do make is often very high performance and looks really good. But yeah, the other thing I think I would say about it is, we are used to a multi-tier housing market where you've got very big volume house builders at the one end, and again you have specialist sort of family firms often at the lower end of things doing individual houses or just custom work on houses. And a modular factory can't be either of those. It has to be its own factory thing. And I've always thought we're not going to quite figure out how to make this thing stack up until we have until it's as easy to drive a house from one end of the country to the other as it is to drive a car. Because of course, if you've got cars, you can just take them on and off carriers and all sorts of ways to get them around, whereas a house, you can't do that.
So we're coming towards the end of the session. Have we got more questions, Paul?
I've got a quick question myself for Mark, if that's all right. There are a couple of kind of questions in the list.
Well, we could carry on after our kind of main closing at 8. But you go ahead, Paul.
Yeah. Mark, I was wondering, because this is in effect, Jimmy's offering accommodation and in a sense running accommodation as opposed to you putting people into accommodation run by other services. I was wondering, has this kind of increased your administration hours and costs? And because these are, you mentioned that on some edges of council estates, there's extra kind of travel time to get to these places as well. Has it kind of increased the workload that you're employing more people to deal with this?
Well, yes, yes, it increases our costs. Yes, we have to have more staff. And when I started 4 years ago, we had about 55 residents, and now we've got space for about 85 now, actually 90. So and that's mainly from the modular homes and expanding a couple of our hostels. But doesn't mean to say that it's more expensive just because it costs us more. And we still have one finance manager and one communications manager and one maintenance manager, so we still have, so I haven't done any sort of cost exercise to see whether the cost per unit has changed. And we're very fortunate because most people aren't ready to work, so we get housing benefit directly to Jimmy's, which contributes towards the cost. And then across Cambridge, people are incredibly generous and donate to Jimmy's, and that also helps towards the cost. So we found that yes, while costs have increased, the combination of those two things has meant that we've got all those costs covered. But our big focus is on minimizing the sort of back office administration and emphasizing the support that's offered to people, which is why probably we've grown to the limit of what we'll grow to in terms of accommodation. Otherwise, it will become like a housing association. So we want to remain sort of local, smallish, with an emphasis on people and support.
Okay, so it sounds like it has been a very effective move for you to do this, and it hasn't created umpteen problems where you've had to kind of employ more people to through all this. So it sounds very effective. Can we jump in with another question from Nicola, Tom?
I'd like to. We promised to finish by about 8, and we're after that. But what I suggest is we will finish the main session. I'm just going to round it up now. But then, if you still have a question or want to discuss a bit more, we'll have a little bit of extra time for those people who are able to stay. And so I really want to thank Rory and Mark for really engaging talk. And I'm wondering what these buildings will be like in the 2080s when they'll be up 60 years up. I won't be here to see them, but I'm kind of imagining they'll be still popular in the bizarre way that the 1950s prefabs are still popular with some people, and they don't want to move out of them. So somebody else will find out. And so you've heard about the fantastic work that Jimmy's has been doing. And so here is an appeal to you to, if you possibly can, please make a donation to Jimmy's to help them do more of this, help move more people move into their new life.
Sorry, Anna's answered the first one, so and I think that's actually a pretty good answer, really. You said that it was they're not as cheap as you'd like. Are you measuring expensiveness per meter squared or per unit?
Per meter squared, generally speaking, is certainly how Andy Hill thinks of it. And yeah, it's pretty much about volume. When it boils down to it, we produce modules in the dozens, and obviously, I think as Anne pointed out, you need to get up to the thousands. and have continuity of production as well. Because obviously the other thing that happens is, in a way, we designed our homes to be too easy to build. They build out in 15 working days it takes to build a solo house when the factory is fully spun up, which is far too fast. We can produce them much faster than we can deploy them even on a good day. It will take about 8 weeks to deliver a site from demolition to completion, and in that time we could knock out many times the number of homes that we would need to deploy. So that's a big one for us. A big learning is that we once we've got the production spun up, we complete our run, and then we've got a significant period of storage before we deploy them, or we completely change the way we do the delivery, and we end up potentially with quite a small boutique factory, a bit like some of the smaller firms I was talking about earlier. And if you have that, your ability then to respond to a large order is almost nil. You would have to hire all your staff back. So it's a very difficult balance to strike.
My other question is a bit more about maintainability. I mean, has any thought gone into maintaining it? I should imagine some of them aren't as well looked after as you might do, and the usual things go wrong and things get wet and all sorts of stuff. So are they designed for maintainability?
I might let Mark speak to the practical nature of it, but certainly the way we designed the homes, we wanted to make sure that the components that were in them would be easily replaceable from a builder's merchant, the likes of B&Q. So the only specialist equipment in there is the MVHR, and everything else is really something that could be we designed to be easily replaced. But Mark has actually had to maintain some of these, so he might have a slightly different version.
I think in terms of the general maintenance, that seems fine and normal and no different to maintaining our other properties. I think the only problems that we've had is because we're the first 6 modular homes for Alia New Meaning, and these are the first Hill homes. There have been teething problems with like sewage pumps having to be replaced, or roofs having to be, recovered. But I think that's more to do with because they were the first, and both Alia, New Meaning, and Hill, have jumped in and sorted those things out, no problem. But the normal maintenance of them has been fine, and we do get the odd one that gets intentionally damaged. That sadly comes with the territory, but yeah, that's my feedback.
Thank you. That's interesting, because it's such an important thing that, I think a lot of homes, there's not enough thought put into that. With things like stopcocks in places you can't get to, and pipes not well, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, Hill have been quite good at coming around and doing surveys with us and surveys with the residents, which I assume then gets fed into the how that's done in the future.
Correct.
I've got a question. Rory, you mentioned you made a brief reference to shipping containers back at the start. Is there a specific reason that you shifted towards kind of making your own as opposed to?
Yeah, well, adapting a shipping container is quite a tall order to make it into housing, actually, Paul. So I remember it was a few years ago, it was regarded as being potentially quite a good route to explore. But what has become apparent over the last few years, and a few providers have tried this, is the proportions of a shipping container aren't really designed for a home. They're much narrower than our solo houses. So, you might have 2.5 meters or so on a shipping container of width, 2 to 3 meters. Well, our modular homes are 4 meters across, which is more like the width of a sort of, I think the Remind Inn is probably slightly narrower than 4 meters. And so what you have when you see an adapted containerized solution is often quite a narrow home to traverse it. You've either got to have one big room with sort of, trick partitions or whatever, or you've got to have a very narrow corridor. And so all those questions about accessibility become an awful lot more fraught if you're adapting a shipping container. The other problem you've got is they're designed to be a hard shell to ship and protect freight. And they're not designed with insulation in mind. So any retrofitted insulation solution is necessarily going to be improvised and sprayed on, you're just not going to get the thermal performance that you would need to have anything like even a conventional level of energy efficient home. So not to rag on the people who've actually done shipping container housing solutions, because it is better than nothing. But the problem that you have is they heat up massively in summer and they freeze in winter in a way that something that's purpose built and that's, you know, insulation is designed in and properly sealed up, which won't do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Kind of thought. And they were in a modular design. Is that kind of a design aspect you thought about in terms of, you know, are they classed as a temporary residents, so they are easier to get planning permission and things like that? Was that a design?
They're not easier to get planning permission on, I would say. Not at all. They're exactly the same as conventional house in as much as we've never managed to get time back off a planning application. It's always been a question. All the same things that you'd question at planning stage are questioned on all of our schemes. If we really wanted to make it, if we wanted to make a kind of pedantic argument about it, we could have reduced the height of the modules by about 6 inches, and that would have given us the eaves height that you could technically classify a single module as an outbuilding under PD. However, that's never how we intended to deploy them. They were never intended as kind of backland sheds. They were always intended as proper long-term homes, you know, for multiple years, and we always intended to deploy them as groups in small schemes. So it just wouldn't have flown. We would always needed to get the change of use, and if you've got the change of use, that's really the vast majority of what the arguments we have are. Is this land suitable for more residential accommodation of a particular type, and under what circumstances could it be made reasonable to do that? And that's the sort of thing, you know, that's where the real meat of the argument always is.
And I think you've just put another question in chat.
Yeah, not very well typed. I was in a bit of a hurry. I mean, given the number of people around here who are desperate for affordable homes, I can't help wondering, you know, I mean, it feels like this ought to be a solution. You know, you've got the capacity to churn out lots of homes, and if you were churning them out like the car industry was doing, and they were debugged, which, I mean, it's taken the car industry a century to get cars as reliable as they now are. But, you know, whatever the price is now, it should be possible. There must be massive economies of scale coming in if you want to actually get it rolling out. So in Cambridge, we've got an emerging local plan which is currently stalled because of, you know, the decisions about whether the water, the sewage works can move. So, you know, is there an opportunity to get it into the local plan to treat this sort of thing sympathetically? You know, then is there a way of actually providing small homes for people who are not particularly at risk of homelessness, but they would just much prefer to have this, because they do look great, you know, rather than having to be in a shared house somewhere or living out at Whittlesford, you know, you know, March or somewhere, you know.
So the part of my answer, I think, Anne, is just straightforward. From your lips to God's ear. I think the reality is, we are quite right. Everything you've said is absolutely correct. We have the ability, and not just through Hill. I mean, you know, all the modular providers in the UK, that we have the technology available to produce large quantities of housing. I think what Mark said earlier is absolutely correct when it comes to how you roll these things up, because it's really about land. It's about how you allocate land. It's about where you compromise on how you deliver it. So, I mean, one of the big problems, obviously, in Cambridge, and I have this conversation with people fairly regularly, is we're a low-lying town. We have a lot of low-lying land that's at flood risk, and there are always questions about our carrying capacity in water terms. I mean, that was certainly one of the big environmentalist challenges to Michael Gove's pronouncement that we needed 250,000 homes recently. And that's the sort of thing where that is a hard question to answer. If it's as simple as producing large quantities of buildings, absolutely, we can do that. If it was as simple as well, it's not necessarily simple to get a kind of sympathetic treatment in planning, but I think Cambridge City probably would be quite sympathetic, and South Cambs might be a different question. I'm not as familiar with them. I expect they probably would be quite sympathetic. but a lot of it's down to the specification. When we tender, we really need a detailed specification from a client to say, we need it to meet X thermal performance standard. And that's got to be good enough at the time we do the tender and not get changed later, because we're going to be designing a system to be produced cost effectively for that spec. So if people want passive house, we'll design a passive house and it'll cost what it'll cost. But if people want something that's building regs compliant and no more, that's a completely different design. And these are sometimes questions that don't really get properly asked at tender stage. They get asked much later in the design process. And that's true of all sorts of development, not just modular. So I think there's, if the industry could be provided with a static target, I think that would make life an awful lot easier for how we addressed it. But that requires a lot of front loading, a lot of policy decisions, which are not something that developers can make. They're something that only political leaders and state officials can make. And to some extent, those are also driven by the sort of cultural needs of the public and what people ask for. And a lot of times what people really want is brick cottages, which is not easy to produce quickly and certainly isn't very space efficient. But that's kind of what people imagine when they think of their own home. So I think as a cultural thing I was saying earlier, but yeah, good point, Anne. We could do it. I agree with you. We could do it. I would love to be part of it. That's part of why I'm doing this job, but it's challenging.
And as you say, it doesn't actually solve the problem of land and water.
Not at all.
Yeah.
You know, other use cases for this sort of modular thing, I was thinking of sort of granny annexes. You know, there must be lots of potential for that as well. And maybe then there's less of an issue on the land, but they've still got the problem of the water.
It's a very interesting question, actually, because I'll be honest with you, if we had created a kind of granny annex compatible system on day one, I could probably be moving a few dozen modules every month out of the factory, just on the strength of inquiries that I get. But as the point is made there, craneage obviously is a huge deal. Not all backland is that easily accessible, and alleyways also are a huge restricting factor on it. It is challenging to use backland on good days when there's a convenient access route. We did one in Stevenage where it was basically a footpath, and we were able to get a crane onto it. But otherwise, we would have been pushing up through two people's gardens, basically. So that, I think, probably you'd need a different system than we use at Hill to do that. It could be done. You'd need a panelized system, probably. And you'd need something that was produced in panels, a bit like, trying to think of a good example, really, but there's quite a few panelized manufacturers out there. We actually bought one last year at Fusion in Northampton, but they're just traditionally assemble flat components and transport them flat and then assemble them on site. But the challenge then becomes, what are you then building? Are you really building something that's the size of a solo house and that's designed for single occupancy? And under what circumstances? If we're talking about people letting out their garden to a tenant, then that's potentially one way of increasing capacity. But you kind of build in a lot of the same things that are making housing unaffordable. You know, you have that landlords still strictly controlling their land and so on. And a lot of what is, at least in theory, supposed to be getting us out of the housing crisis is increasingly among people who either own their own home or have some more complicated stake in the land. But yeah, that's a fair point. It's a fair point. It would be a different product, I suppose, is what I would say.
Well, thank you all, people who participated and great speakers. I think it was a real eye-opener to me that you've had no complaints about this space, living in 24 square meters. I think that's a real tribute to what you've done. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Nice talking
Thank
to you
you,
all.
everyone. Bye.
Good night.